Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast where you'll hear from extraordinary, trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity and the founder of Fearless Women, a company with a powerful ambition to drive positive change for women's sport. I'm thrilled to say that this series of The Game Changers is supported by Sport England, who've done so much to tackle the inequalities women face across all areas of sport. From the wonderful This Girl Can campaign and initiatives that help shape school sport for girls to schemes that encourage more female volunteers in the workforce, support female coaches and officials, and ensure more women from all backgrounds take leadership positions on the boards of sports organisations. My guest today is Dame Sarah Storey, the most successful British female Paralympian of all time, with 38 world titles, 14 Paralympic Golds and 76 world records. Sarah was just 14 when she made her Paralympic debut at Barcelona '92, winning 5 gold medals, including 2 golds. She went on to win more medals in the pool at Atlanta, Sydney and Athens before moving to cycling and winning more medals on the track and the road at Beijing, London and Rio. Sarah is also 6 times British national track champion. Sarah and her husband Barney now run Storey Racing, and Sarah is also the active travel commissioner for the Sheffield City region. I asked Sarah to share her memories of that first Paralympics in Barcelona.
I was racing in Barcelona in '92, a German girl who'd never been beaten, Claudia Hengst, and she was kind of the nemesis of everybody in the S10 category. And she was unbeatable as far as everyone was concerned. And it was the first time I'd come across this concept that, somebody was untouchable in sports. And I just didn't buy that as a kid. You don't, do you? Kind of like think, I'm not going to believe that, make my own decisions. So she beat me in the 400 meters freestyle, but I did a huge personal best time. And one of the things that I'd always focused on as a kid, because I was never quite good enough for the national age group champs in the able-bodied swimming, was that I beat my personal best. And if I beat my best, then that was all we could do. And in going a huge PB in the 400, I got a silver medal. So I was absolutely over the moon, and it set me up for the week. So when it came to the 100 meters backstroke, which was my first real opportunity to kind of beat her, I was just so excited, but also really concerned that maybe everyone was right, because she had won everything up until that point. And the first sort of 15 meters of the race, all I could see was this enormous splash. And I just thought, that's a leg kick. And actually it was her arms. And when we got to the turn and I saw the scoreboard and I was a second and a half ahead of her, I was just like, wow. And I smashed myself all the way up the second 50 and broke the world record by a good few seconds and beat her by about nearly 3 seconds, I think. And it was just like, wow, it's possible, she can be beaten. So yeah, I really remember that excitement of proving that Claudia Hengst, who's a fantastic girl, a fair few years older than me, I suppose she must have been. But yeah, it was really cool. And then I went on a few days later to beat her again in the 200 meter individual medley. And so I had to come behind her again in the 100 freestyle when I got my bronze medal and be part of a relay team. I think the Germans or the Americans won the relays when we got 2 silvers. So yeah, she'd been a big rival all that week, and she continued to be for a good few years after.
And what was it like being the youngest person on that team?
Well, I wasn't actually the youngest. So bizarrely, there was 2 other girls who were 14 as well. Vicky Sims, now called Vicky Foley, and Rachel Peachy, now called Rachel Foot. And so they were both a few weeks younger. Like I was October, Vicky was the 30th of December, and Rachel was somewhere in the middle. And there was a girl called Claire Bishop, who's now Claire Cunningham, works for Paralympics GB. She just turned 15. And there was a lad called Ian Matthew, who was also 15. So there was 5 of us who were year 9 or 10 at school, who were all in that team together. And then a few others who were probably A-level style. So there was quite a big contingent of youngsters there, and then a really big contingent of swimmers in their early 20s. And so it was quite a really nice balance, I think.
And what are your overriding memories of that first experience?
Well, I remember the roar of the stadium when we walked in for the opening ceremony, because it wasn't sort of even coined the idea that you needed to rest at that point, ready for competition. And we stood out in the heat for hours on end and just like had an absolute ball. But I think that was the way it needed to be, because as a kid, I wouldn't have known that it was time to rest. I would have been restless in the village anyway. But we just had this incredible roar as we walked into that stadium. And no other stadium has come close, really. And maybe the closing ceremony at London 2012. But yeah, it was just insanely good. And the size of the crowds they were all bigger than anyone had expected. The Paralympics was really taken to the heart of the people in Barcelona. They loved the competition of the Olympics, and they heard the Paralympics were coming, and they just wanted to be a part of that as well. So they reopened the closed parts of the stadium in the swimming pool. So the temporary stands got reopened, and they had full houses as they had for the Olympics. So it was amazing.
Excellent. And being out in the heat obviously didn't affect you, because you went on to win, I think, 3 golds, 2 silvers and a bronze. Is that correct?
2 gold, 3 silver and a bronze in Barcelona. And yeah, the heat, I think that was the thing. It's kind of like there's so much psychosomatic element to this as well. And so if you believe that you're going to need that rest, then you need that rest, and you have that choice. And I think that's the key for any athlete. You'll hear about it next year in Tokyo as well. Having that choice to go to the opening ceremony is really the key part. And obviously we know when we've had members of the cycling team, like Chris Hoy, carried the flag. So they made it possible by putting in place the right things to make sure it wasn't an issue for performance. But largely now we don't go to the opening ceremony because, well, certainly for Tokyo next year, we're going to be too far away from Tokyo itself to be even in the right city.
And when did that actually sink in? I guess that extraordinary number of medals that you won at your very first games.
I don't really know, because I think it probably wasn't until I was maybe at university and going through the problems I had with chronic fatigue syndrome that I realised just what had happened to me as a kid, and just what a career I'd set up for myself. And I suppose it's only really as I've got a little bit older that I've realised that the enormity of doing what I did as a 14-year-old. And it was amazing for me to be in Beijing when Ellie Simmonds, because I was the youngest gold medalist until Ellie Simmonds in Beijing. So to watch her do what she did and know what she had ahead of her was just so exciting, but also gave me that opportunity to really appreciate that I was just a few weeks older than Ellie when I won mine. And then, yeah, so I guess it was quite a long time after, although at the time I was like, yeah, it's really exciting. And I think also in the run up to the games in Atlanta, when I was doing my A-levels at the same time, I probably realised the enormity of the job in hand of trying to have that like 2 careers, I suppose.
And did you just go back to school? So you're in that year, 10, 11, yeah.
So I think we got back from Barcelona on something like the Wednesday or Thursday of a week, say. And I had a few days at home and went down to London to go on to Blue Peter with Tanny, Gray Thompson, Simon Jackson, Chris Holmes, Dave Moore, and a couple of the table tennis players, 1 or 2 of the other track and field athletes. And there was a group of us in the studio. So high school, I think we did that on the Friday. So high school said, look, go do these things, then come back on Monday. And that's like draw a line under it and come back. So I'd had 3 weeks of the term like off. So I got back on the Monday. I think maybe we got home Wednesday. Thursday, I went into school to show the medals. Friday, I went to Blue Peter. Monday, I started back in year 10. And so it was really quite strange. And going back to school was really good to start with, and then not great after that, because I think because I did just draw a line under it, I was like, right, medals in the box, back to school, GCSEs. As you know, it's kind of like, so important, drilled into you. And I didn't really talk about Barcelona again. And because I'd been told not to distract myself or anyone else. So then that led to a sort of a small faction of girls thinking that I thought I was too good for them and didn't want to talk about it because I was uppity, whereas it was really quite the opposite. So I had a fairly sort of lonely existence, I suppose, for the final 2 years at high school.
And who told you not to talk about it? Was that the school that had said, don't talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, if you can imagine a school, they didn't really know how to kind of cope with this. All this press had turned up at school during the games. That my swimming club had the press down every night when the days I'd won medals. They'd had another pupil at school who I think she was in 6th form or just finished, who'd made the team for the Olympics. And so they had two of us, but one of us kind of went into catastrophic measures of medals. And so it was kind of, how do we handle this to make it fair to Sarah, fair to the rest of the pupils? So the idea was, come in, don't do lessons, and show everyone your medals and have that kind of social time, but then draw a line under it and concentrate on work. And I got back into training straight away. So I was arriving at school with wet hair and kind of like move on to the next event, which at that point was 2 years later, was going to be the World Championships. So I was just like, yes, let's get on. I want to do another one. I want to race again. And so for me, it wasn't a hard thing to kind of do that, because I was doing little jaunts out. I had like the Sunday Times School Girl of the Year that I won, and other little events that sort of awards ceremonies in the run up to Christmas. But I just kept them to myself. I didn't really kind of want to distract anyone in lessons. So in some ways, if I'd been the big head and kind of, look at me, guess where I'm going tomorrow, I probably would have been in the same position anyway. So I guess it was just one of those situations where I was doing something unusual. It was exciting. And, most bullying at school is down to some form of misunderstanding or jealousy. And it wasn't great at the time. And I really struggled with it, but kept focusing on what my mum and dad was saying, of make sure that you just remember your career in sport or whatever you want to do is forever. And it's only however many months left until GCSEs start.
Moving on. And what made you so competitive? So even at such a young age, what do you think drove you? Is that something you've seen within your family?
I'm not 100% sure. I remember watching the Olympics in '84. That was the first one I remember, and just loved the competition and just wanted to get involved with any sport going. My primary school was an incredibly sporty school. It had its own swimming club. So I was racing in the school swimming galas from probably being in year 4. But I was fastest swimmer in the school, year 4, 5 and 6. So I was kind of ahead of all my peers, even though I was a paddle short, as it were. And we played netball. We played in an adult table tennis league, even though we were at primary school. So I had a really nurturing headmaster, Chris Parker, and he was just incredible. And there was so many different opportunities at primary school, at state primary school, that you probably wouldn't find now, which is really sad. And that sporting element that brought all the kids together outside of classrooms and made us work really hard when we were in the classroom. And it worked. And I went on to kind of take that sport to the next level.
And then at 27, you changed over to take up cycling. So why did that occur?
Well, basically, at the end of 2004, after every games, I used to go and do something different for a little bit, cross-training, I suppose. Quite a lot of the time it was running or something. It might have been, going rock climbing. And after the games in Athens, I went down to the Manchester Velodrome to learn how to ride on a fixed-wheel bike. And I'd not ridden a bike much, probably all through university, and in the run-up to those games. I'd commuted on my bike to college and do my A-levels and then on to swim training. So I had used a bike, but not a fixed wheel. So I went to the Velodrome, and I'd been at the Commonwealth Games, and the Velodrome had been kind of the site where we'd gone to and from the stadium for those ceremonies. So I was really curious. And then I went off to Australia to do some traveling. And while I was in Australia, it turned out I picked up this ear infection that kind of plagued all of 2005. So cycling just became this thing I used as a cross-training tool until my ears got better, except the ear infections just rolled on and on and on. And so I ended up racing on a bike, as you do. And then British Cycling spotted me just doing a public session, and they were a bit curious. I still had really huge shoulders, and they invited me to a trial over 3,000 meters, which is the distance of the individual pursuit, on fairly kind of sort of rough and ready. It's not the Secret Squirrel Club equipment anyway. I did a time that was outside of the then world record by just a second. So they're like, oh, right, okay, well, if we put a little bit of effort into you and your equipment, you might go quite quick. So 3 weeks later, I was racing at the European Championships with marginally better equipment, and I did go a little bit quicker, won the gold medal, broke the world record. And a few days later was outside for the road events, because at that point they were still doing combined track and road championships. And I won the road race in a bunch sprint, and they were like, oh, we normally have to teach people about the bunch. You've got it straight away. I was like, okay. I was just kind of using that instinct of sport and competitiveness. So I then had a decision to make. Was I going back to the pool? Was I going to stay on a bike? Because I had lottery funding in both sports if I'd wanted to do either. So there was no kind of financial decision to make. It was about, inspiration and what I had as, my end goal and ambition. So I had a long chat with my swimming coach. It took us ages to decide because I kept thinking, well, the home games is the one I could do on cycling, but what about doing Beijing in the pool? And we had this discussion back and two. And he said, if you were my daughter, I would tell you to go and get on your bike, because he said, I just think you're not old, but you're getting that bit too old in the pool. And so he was right. It was the right decision to make. And on the 1st of October, literally all UK Sport does was move my file out of the swimming section, put it in the cycling section. And cycling let me have another sort of 6 weeks to make my personal transition to it, because I wanted to do another competition in the pool to prove to myself as much as anything that I was capable of being back to the best I had been. So I raced at the national champs in that very early November of 2005 and was, a few hundredths of a second outside of the world record on the 100-meter freestyle, and was like, yeah, there we go. I was capable of making that comeback. It was my decision to change sports.
And what was tough about changing sports at 27? Because you've made it sound like it was a fairly smooth transition there.
I think the biggest sort of decision was about the technicalities of cycling, because, I looked at myself as someone who you definitely had a disadvantage on a bike, in the swimming pool. But on a bike, it's all about your legs, isn't it? And actually, they proved to me very rapidly that the contribution of your upper body and having the grip on both sides is way bigger than most people understand. And certainly I understood. So the technicalities of being able to brake independently, change gear either side, have balance and equal pull on the bars for the biggest of efforts, those kind of things put me at a significant disadvantage, and I wasn't really sure about it. So I said at the very get-go, well, I want you to make sure that you judge me physically based on the same figures you judge the able-bodied girls, because when you put me on a static bike, that's where it's at, really. And they agreed. So we were able to sort of set about a process of really moving on the sport of paracycling by having that end goal of being physically as capable. And that the only difference that we were going to allow was any technical differences that we had to find a way around. So that might have been an adaptation of some kind that would plug some of the gap, but make sure that from a physical perspective, I trained in exactly the same way, and I was tested in exactly the same way, and I was benchmarked in the same way when it came to any of those, key performance indicators. And that's what we did. And I think very rapidly, that's why I ended up in that position of going towards the team pursuit squad, racing on the road. And ultimately, by the time I got to Beijing, the time that I raced on the track would have been 7th at the Olympics. And so very quickly, we'd got me into that position where I was, racing the likes of Rebecca Romero on the road, who went on to win that Olympic gold medal, and then, racing alongside her, Joanna Vousel, Wendy Hoovenagel, Laura Trott, Danny King, as we prepared for that Games in London in 2012 with their first women's team pursuit.
And did you have any concerns at the time about the culture of cycling when it came to female cyclists?
Well, at the time, there was a real drive to make sure that we sort of changed track cycling. I came into track cycling first, and at that point in Beijing, there was fewer events on the programme. So if you look what that was, where Chris Hoy won his triple gold and Victoria Pendleton won a single gold medal, because there was no other event that she could have competed in. So there was very much a need for levelling up, and that was done immediately after Beijing. And then probably parallel to that was a similar situation in paracycling, because we had fewer events in the female side and more events where we were combined with other categories. And every single one of my events in Beijing was combined with another category and on a factor, as they called it. So although I was beating everybody by at least 20 seconds on the actual track, my factored time, I only won the race in Beijing by 23 100ths. And the girl I beat went on to go into the same category as me once they refreshed the categories and kind of upgraded the system. So there was a lot of development needed to be done. And it was probably part of the kind of honour, is, I suppose, to be a part of that group of women that really pushed track cycling to where it needed to be. And now we see that even, after one Games, the team pursuit moved up to 4,000 metres and four athletes. And so it feels like we're kind of on a similar journey with the roadside. It's just taking that little bit longer because I don't know, it just seems to be more difficult. And I guess the men's side of the sport has gone to extreme lengths in terms of race distances, that it makes it almost, do we need them to meet us halfway to make it completely equal? How are we going to solve this challenge? Because I'm not sure that it's the right thing to do to have, 250-kilometre races. The women's racing being shorter, it goes from the gun, and it's a full gas race for like 3.5 hours, and that means it's a different offering to spectators as well as the fans.
Absolutely. So you and your husband Barney now head up Team Storey Sport. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So in 2009 we set up Team Storey Sport as kind of like an education business in sport. We utilised our experiences to either coach people, coach businesses, deliver motivational keynote speeches. And so just that education around what we've learned in our sporting careers and how we can apply that to other people, whether that's a corporate, big corporate business and their executives or their high flyers, or whether it's the people who are kind of the beavering away on the ground and want to know how to keep their motivation going when it feels like all you're doing is working really hard and not making any progress. Right the way through to schools, colleges, anything really, anyone where they want to learn the lessons of sport. So we set up our own business to do that. That allowed both of us to have another string to our bow, as my dad would put it, and gave us that opportunity to kind of do something, put back a little bit into sport as well, as finding a way of creating a career alongside our own competitions. And then off the back of that, we set up Storey Racing in 2013, just as my daughter was about 3 months old. And we decided we needed to set up a team that would enable me to race where I needed to race with family ties, but also where I needed to race going back into paracycling as well. Because one thing we'd learned from my time in team pursuiting was that very much it's not always your own decisions and what happens. And I wanted to protect the paracycling racing, because although I was very much getting success and the able-bodied side of the sport, my roots have obviously always been parasport, and I didn't want to ever have to be forced to make a decision between the two, because I would have made the choice to do the parasport racing, I think, but I wanted that decision to be mine so I could set up my schedule. So Storey Racing started out as a sponsored team, and we were sponsored by a number of different companies, and then we changed the name in 2017, so the name never ever changed again, and it became a more regular, people understood exactly what it was that we were doing, instead of it being named after a brand and everyone saying, well, who's behind that?
And what was your vision for that team?
Well, the vision's probably changed over the years. Initially, it was to take it into the UCI ranks and to have a UCI team, but alongside that, provide opportunities for other women to kind of make that step up. But alongside our plans to kind of take that to that level, the UCI were obviously working alongside the various different campaigners to bring more equality to the female side of professional cycling. So now we have a situation where it's actually a lot harder to run, as it should be, a UCI team. You certainly can't run it from your garage like we were doing anymore. And so we've readjusted our expectations of where we can take the team. And we're very much a UK-based development team, if you like, but with that reach into the professional ranks when needed. So we can provide the right opportunities with links to race organisers, but we're not a full-time professional outfit on the road, probably from January to October, which wouldn't be practical with a young family. So we have that experience at the higher level, but we obviously also then have that nurturing opportunity at the UK level. And at the moment, we have juniors or youth riders, junior riders, under 23 and seniors and paracyclists. And so we manipulate the makeup of the team according to the right type of athletes and where we think we can make a difference to an individual.
And how was it all going pre-COVID?
Well, the team was going great. We were looking towards 3 or 4 riders getting selection for the Tokyo Games, maybe even 5, I think, if we had an outside, really, really great selection time. We were looking to race abroad. We have links to the Skoda DSI Cycling Academy, where we're trying to develop and nurture riders under that banner with the This Is Our Time campaign that Skoda have set up. So we had kind of like a lot of irons in the fire, if you like, to support as many different women as we could who had different challenges and different ambitions. And so when lockdown happened, we had to cancel the trips that we'd got planned abroad. We thought we might be racing in the Netherlands and Sweden and various different places in the run up to national championships at the end of June. And then obviously that would then lead us into a final build up into Tokyo. So whether we can replicate that next year remains to be seen. Obviously, lots of things have changed, and the commercial side of sport and the availability of sponsorship is still a little bit unknown. And I think you look down at the lower ranked teams, if you like, and those are the ones that aren't as 100% sure of how they fit into that bigger picture, because the bigger picture hasn't been kind of completely ironed out yet. So we have seen the return of the Women's World Tour with Strade Bianchi at the weekend, and we're hopeful that other races will go ahead. But as we see the ebb and flow of the virus and this sort of threat of a second wave, or the final weeks of the first wave, however it is, it really is a little bit of an unknown. And we know already that the women who were planning to ride the Tour de France a day ahead of the men, their plans have had to change. So it really is a lot of unknown, and we just have to try and be patient and hope for the best, and think that next year there will be a way for us to rectify what we couldn't do this year and still provide opportunities.
And what's the position like for young women now who want to race professionally? I read Nicole Cook's book a few years ago now, that feels, isn't it, when it was all a bit shocking, really. But have things changed significantly for women in that space?
Yeah, women's professional cycling, there are some fantastic teams out there, and we had Eleanor Baxted on our team last year, who got bronze in Harrogate in the Junior World Championship time trial. She moved on to Trek Segafredo, which is where Lizzie Deignan is, and they have a superb setup which is linked into the men's team. There are other teams like Sunweb, which is where a colleague at British Cycling, Matt Winston, is now one of the main coaches, and they have a men's and women's team. And I think that's where Pfeiffer Georgie has gone. She's a British rider as well. So there's a significant number of very big men's teams who've got a women's team. Movistar is another one. And so all of those teams have provided a very similar setup for the men and the women. Mitchelton Scott is the Australian team that does that. So there are some very, very big teams who are doing the right thing. And then there are some incredibly good women's teams who are just standalone female teams, like Bowles Dolmans, who are going to take on a new title sponsorship. And they're probably one of the sort of beacon teams, if you like, because they had a very long-standing sponsorship with Bowles Rental and the Dolmans Gardening. And that ended at the same time, but they managed to find a sponsor to take them on to another 4 years to apply to be in the Women's World Tour and to hopefully be that World Tour team from next year. And so in a market where people were unsure, to see that happen was really, really encouraging. And that's been, a sort of a mainstay of the women's peloton for many, many years. And then you have other teams like Team Tibco from the States, who've also been a very well-established, long-lasting team, and they're headed up. Their head coach is Rachel Hederman, who used to race for Great Britain. So there's a really strong network of incredible women who are working off the back of their own careers, and they're now working in the sport. So that brings around that change that you perhaps need, where previously women have said that they've not had the best experience. Obviously, when the women come back into their own sport and try and move it along, they bring that experience of either being, a colleague of someone who had a hard time, or having had to experience it and not really know how to tackle it. So it's really exciting to see those women. Giorgia Bronzini's involved as well in the women's peloton now. And so you've got so many names that are coming back into the sport. And so I think that gives it a much brighter future.
Oh, I'm so pleased you've painted such a positive picture of where things are. That's lovely to hear. You've obviously now got 2 young children, Charlie and Louisa, and you've been a real trailblazer for female athletes in terms of, I guess, returning not just after 1 child, but after 2. Were there women that inspired you?
I guess for me, I watched Tanny have Caris Caris is probably nearly 20. And so it's such a long time ago, but I was really inspired by the fact that she came back. And I think when I was having Louisa, I was like, yeah, I can race the World Championships. Louisa will be 10 weeks old, because Tanny had raced, she'd kind of made everything possible. She's one of those people who've been present my whole career. She won 4 gold medals in Barcelona, and she's always been an incredible support. When I wanted to find out how to get involved with the motivational speaking, she was the person I went to. And Tanny gave me that mentorship that I could blossom under. And I think if you look across, there are other women, Paula Radcliffe had children, but even further back than that, perhaps Liz McColgan. And so there are lots of women who've come back after having children, but they're perhaps not always been celebrated. But then I don't know whether that's so much of a problem, because we don't want to make it out to be something that's unusual. It's just a normal part of your life when it's ready for you as an individual. I think there are some things that don't need to go, they don't need to be sort of out there. Are you planning to have a baby is an incredibly, personal question. But somehow certain parts of the press seem to think it's okay to ask. It's like, well, mind your own business, thanks very much. And that's something I actually said after the games in Rio, because as a woman, you just don't know. You might fall pregnant, you might not. But having one child or having two, it's your own personal decision. And if you have more, then great. But so I think there was lots of other women you could look to and think it is something that's possible. And I think now we see riders like Lizzie Deignan and Laura Kenny, and they've had children. And then even a colleague of mine, Nairi Kindred, who had her first child, Ella, 15 months before the games in London. It was just amazing to see her come back and take silver in the pool after a baby, baby that was still very tiny, really.
And did you ever think you would come back stronger after motherhood?
I really, really didn't know whether I'd be one of those women that'd come back stronger. Another colleague of mine, Jeanette Chippington, who now is in the canoe, she raced when she was 6 months pregnant in the pool with her first. And I remember just being in awe of this bump gliding through the water so beautifully. And she came back stronger, and she's obviously gone from strength to strength because she switched sports, and she's now in the boat as well, in the canoe. So I think you kind of wonder. And Nairi told me she definitely didn't come back stronger, but I was really fortunate that I was one of those ladies that blossomed in pregnancy. I had no sickness. It was just something that I absolutely loved, being pregnant. And I raced with Charlie when I was pregnant with him. I didn't race with Louisa. I raced national champs when I was very early pregnancy, and then raced time trials right the way through till about 22 weeks. Wow. And then kind of got a bit too big.
And how do you juggle the life of an elite athlete and a parent, especially in a sport that does require so much travelling and training?
Well, I have the most amazing husband, and having Barney on side who knows all about the ins and outs of it. He was an elite road racer before he turned to the track, so he understands both sides of the sport brilliantly. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I am one of the few athletes who's doing track and road to the same level, because I have his support. And he's like, well, why can't you? You don't need to specialize. And I didn't want to specialize as a schoolgirl when I was told to choose between swimming, table tennis, netball, cross country, rounders, and all that. So why would I want to choose to specialize, as it were, now? So his support, he's sort of been a full-time dad since Louisa arrived, with his coaching business, as and when he can find the time to tap away on his keyboard. And that's the beauty, I suppose, of the mobile phones. And he stays in touch with his riders that way. So we're really fortunate. And he obviously then can be right at the wheel for the team car when we're away on the road. My parents have always travelled everywhere. So with or without the grandchildren, they've always been alongside the racing from the stands or from the roadside. So they've come along with two extra little ones, and we've got some fabulous pictures. The Tour of California, we seem to get loads and loads of pictures. It maybe have been the American journalists were just in awe of this little girl who was with me at all the press conferences as well. And it was just lovely. And then I guess the only time that we've had to kind of make decisions is around school time. So we've done a lot of homeschooling, I suppose. So it did set us up well for lockdown, but we didn't want to do too much. We wanted to make sure she had that sort of settled status of being in the classroom and knowing her routine at school as well. So we've been fairly selective, probably since Charlie arrived, on just how much time out in term time we will take. And it's just worked well. And I think being selective as I've got older in the sport means that I can kind of pick and choose and maintain the very best performances without that risk of injury from being on the road, week in, week out.
Everybody needs a Barney. It's a proper team story, isn't it, really?
Yeah, Barney is the absolute hero of the whole family, and he doesn't get enough credit.
We'll give him a big shout out there. You've obviously won so much competing over the years, and I know it's a question you're often asked, but what does drive you now to keep going back for more medals?
Well, I think now that the children are with us, it provides a completely different dynamic, and their enjoyment and experience and learnings are all part of the motivation for me, because I can provide the opportunity for us to do rather unusual things as a family by still being, right at the top of the sport. And they get to meet people that perhaps they wouldn't have met otherwise. And we get to go to places and parts of places that you don't normally go to off the beaten track, say. So I think it's part of that whole life experience and that journey that we're going on together. My enjoyment of racing hasn't waned. I love racing. I still get the butterflies and think, why am I doing this? What's the outcome going to be? Am I going to be good enough today? The natural experience that any athlete will have. But then challenging yourself in that way and giving that challenge and sort of learning to your kids is a completely different level. And I know a lot of athletes who have children who've said, "What now that I'm racing with my kids here, it just feels even better." So for me, I think Charlie experiencing his first games a year older than he would have done if it was this month, then it means hopefully he'll remember it. And then Louisa said to me the other week, before lockdown we were on a training camp. She goes, "You know what, Mum, you can't ever stop racing because I just love these training camps." I was like, right, okay. So yeah, I'm going to be going to the games. Her first games will be my last games and all this joking. But yeah, it's one of those situations where I think, hopefully I'll know when I know. And I think I remember hearing someone like Matt Pinsent say that, when it's the right time. And I don't think I'll ever declare, get me off my bike and never put me back on again, as Steve Redgrave did at that time. But yeah, it's just a way of life now that involves that really hard work. And I've always thrived off really hard work. So I think that's a good thing.
And did that extra year to Tokyo affect you in a different way, perhaps, to other athletes at the stage of career you're at?
I think a lot of people expected the extra year to be a really big thing for me, a really big problem. I think I'd kind of accepted before the decision was even made that something was going to happen to the games, because it was logical that unless they came up with a really clever quarantine plan, it didn't seem possible that we could all travel to Japan within a few months, given the severity of the virus. So when the announcement came, I was like, yeah, there we go. It was coming. We just needed to be patient. And it was difficult that, no one had ever experienced lockdown or this chance, certainly swimmers had never experienced not being allowed to go to the pool. And it must have been horrible. We were fortunate as a road cyclist, we had that one slot of exercise a day. So the only decision we had to make was whether that was a walk with the kids or a bike ride for yourself. So turbo trainers came in very handy. And I think I expected something, and I was delighted it wasn't just completely cancelled, because I think that would have been one of the real possibilities given all the other logistics that are around the games. So it was good to hear that it was only a postponement, as it were, because it could have been a lot worse. So now we hope. We just keep and wait and be patient. And not knowing when I was going to start racing again whilst I was pregnant, I think it's a similar mentality of patience. It's going to happen at some point. You just have to be ready. And that's an adaptability athletes haven't had to have before, but we have to be adaptable. And this is a case where, we're needing to be very, very adaptable.
And what events are you training for in Tokyo?
So I'm training for the same 4 events that I won in London, that I won 3 of the 4 of in Rio. So the individual pursuit is on the day after the opening ceremony. I think that's now the 25th of August. It was announced yesterday. Then the 2 days later is the 500 meter time trial, which is an event I won in London. I came 4th in Rio. The sprinters turned up in Rio. So if they don't turn up again in Tokyo, I'll take them out again. And then on the 31st of August, it's the road time trial. And the 2nd of September is the road race. So then there's a couple of days and it's the closing ceremony. So yeah, it's good to have the schedule out again. It's exactly the same as it was had it been this year in terms of the order of events. So yeah, we just build back up again and see what next year holds.
Are you 44 this year?
I'm 43 this year, so I'll be 44 just after the games next year.
Next year. How does your body respond now versus to training when you were like a 14-year-old?
Well, it's interesting looking at how my body responds, because I had chronic fatigue syndrome as a 21-year-old. And so I really was in a right state. I got to the point where I ended up having 6 weeks complete rest and then started on 5 minutes a day in the pool. And my coach at the time, Colin Hood, was just incredible at keeping me on the straight and narrow to get me to recover. So now I kind of feel that this strength I have is a real blessing, because I can go out for, hours and hours on end. And the main challenge for training is just being correctly fueled and having enough fluid. So, the amount of food I take on a ride is absolutely ridiculous. I usually need to eat all through my rides, and just keep on top of those fluids. But I think it's the intensity that online racing has given me during lockdown, because we haven't been able to race outside, and that's maintained a level of fitness. But yeah, so far I'm kind of holding on to this sort of gradual rise. I feel like I'm still improving. There's still things I can do better, which is good. And we're exploring some of the technical things that I'd never had the opportunity to do before. So I went into the wind tunnel at the Boardman Performance Centre, which I think is sadly a casualty of lockdown now in terms of a business. But I went in there for the first time last July, and now I'm working with a company to design some 3D printed handlebars. So, I said to my husband, can we really justify the cost of this? I'm in my 40s. He said, yeah, but you've got to do all the bits you can to find the absolute best version of you. And so, so I was like, right, okay, as I write the check, shaking hand. But we're looking at the opportunities to make me better from all different angles, and that whole idea that you leave no stone unturned, and the marginal gains concept that cycling's so well known for.
Absolutely. And you talked there about eating. Fueling is obviously so important. So has that always been, I guess, a key part of your training and the whole package through your career?
Well, I suffered with an eating disorder when I was 15. I think coming back from the games, I was I wasn't a big athlete, but to some people I was a big athlete. I was a 14-year-old who looked like she was in her 20s. I was strong. I was very physically capable. And so there was just one comment about, and I just got, I'm more muscly than I should be. So I had maybe, 7-8 months of really disordered eating. And I was never diagnosed with any formal condition, but it was very close. And my GP was amazing. And she said, you don't want to be diagnosed. You don't want to be put on that path, because there are significant things that then you have to move through in terms of a process to come off of that diagnosis. So she sorted me out, which I was really grateful for. I am now. I don't know whether I was at the time, because it was a bit of control that I had. And maybe it was also a bit of reaction to the reaction I'd had from my peers at school and bullying. I felt like I had control over my eating, whereas I didn't have very much control over anything else at school in terms of their attitude towards me. So having had that experience, I think that I'm well placed to kind of spot it in other people. How I help them get through that, I'm not so sure, but if I can help them to understand the importance of nutrients and of having a nutritious diet, so we focus on the things that are going to do your body good instead of whether or not it's got a calorie in it, then those things really help. And now I'm very, very aware that we don't count calories. We look at the nutrition value of food and what it does for your body as an engine, rather than anything else. So it's interesting for me now as well, working in active travel, and the whole idea of the obesity strategy that links into getting people more active, is that focusing on the positive that you can do rather than counting the negative. And that's something that I've not seen yet, and I think we need to focus on how you can make yourself better by doing things positively rather than banning things because they're negative. So I think we've still got some way to go on that side.
Absolutely. And we've obviously seen a massive increase in cycling during lockdown. And I realise you're now the Active Travel Commissioner for Sheffield City Region, a new role. But it's not always been a sport that women have flocked to in the way they have running. Why do you think that has been in the past?
Well, cycling has a significantly fewer women in than men in terms of everyday cycling as well. And we did a study at British Cycling and found that 66% of women just cited safety. And actually, most people just cite safety, not just women, but it seems to be something that is more prevalent in the female population, that concern around the behaviour of other road users and how the greatest threat of harm and of a motor vehicle or a larger vehicle could do to them. And you are incredibly vulnerable on a bike, on a horse, when you're running with pedestrians. And we see far too many instances of pedestrians killed on pavements by vehicles as well. So the whole spectrum of, out and about on our roads is just one that needs, looking at. And that's what was announced last week. The government want to, redress the highway code and finally pull it to the 21st century, because it's been added to but never kind of taken away from, I suppose. It's a sport that can give us so much if we can address those safety concerns, and running feels, a lot less of an issue in terms of safety, because you can take yourself off the beaten track, and it's a little bit of me time away from having to think about other things. And with cycling, there's a huge amount of concentration perhaps needed, or it's perceived that you need a huge amount more concentration. And actually, cycling is no more dangerous. You're just as likely to trip over when you're running as you are likely to fall off your bike. But I think it's just that the road conditions feel so horrible, and we just need more segregated infrastructure. So it keeps us incredibly busy, because it's important that when we're starting to reallocate road space, that it's not seen by a huge motoring lobby as being an attack against them. It's actually for them as well, because if we can get many more of those short car journeys off the road, then those businesses that rely on vehicles to deliver equipment and to carry out the services that they do, they'll have more space for themselves and for their employees. And the vast majority of car journeys that are made are less than 5 kilometres, which is an absolutely cyclable distance. And even in the UK, 14 kilometres is our average commute. And with the advent of e-bikes, if we have the right infrastructure, almost every single journey could potentially be done without the need for a motor vehicle.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's so true. And just in closing, if you had the chance now to go back and talk to that 14-year-old self standing on the blocks there, what advice would you give her today?
I'd give her the same advice as I was given, because I think one of the reasons why I've been able to do what I've done and continue to enjoy my sport and have success is because I was, looked after so well as a teenager. So my parents always told me to focus on my own performance and to control what I could control, which was a very, profound thing to say, because it's all part of the marginal gains concept and the way that Steve Peters taught us all so well within cycling. So to have all of their advice confirmed as being kind of gold standard was just, it thrilled me that I'd been following it anyway. And also a piece of advice that my swimming coach in the run up to the games in Atlanta said, he said, everybody can be ordinary, but you need to be extraordinary. And it was a really clever way of using the two words. And I just thought, what, that's right. You watch other athletes that have done things, and they've been talked about, the high jumper that stayed back to do extra work, or the Johnny Wilkinsons that stayed back to do extra kicks or whatever. And that for me was all part of it. And I remember watching a documentary about Sarah Hardcastle, who was one of my absolute heroes of the 84 games, because she was called Sarah and she was so young as well at 15. But she talked about working by herself and training on her own and really thriving as an individual, not needing to have any external motivation. She had it all intrinsically. And for me, that, really rung true with this idea of being extraordinary. So, those two pieces of advice have stuck with me my whole career.
What an incredible woman. And I do love that idea of being extraordinary in order to succeed in sport. I wish Sarah every success in her new role as the Active Travel Commissioner, and also for her and her team ahead of the Tokyo Games. If you're enjoying the Game Changers, please do take a minute to review and rate the podcast, as it makes a big difference to raising our profile and ensuring more people get to hear the stories of these trailblazing women in sport. Another big thank you to Sport England for their kind support of the Game Changers, and thanks also to Sam Walker from What Goes On Media, who's our very talented executive producer. You can find out more about all 41 of my incredible guests from this and the previous series at fearlesswomen.co.uk, or come and say hello on social media, where you'll find us at Sue Anstiss or at The Game Changers on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. My guest next week is Alison Oliver, the Chief Executive of the Youth Sport Trust, the charity building a brighter future for young people through the power of sport.
I've come across plenty of women for whom sport has damaged them, whether that is the way in which it's been delivered, or whether there's been sort of no sense of the value and purpose of this thing called sport ever articulated to girls.
The Game Changers. Fearless Women in Sport.